The moment the swarm fractured, it did not retreat in the way a conventional enemy would but instead reorganized with unsettling speed, like a shattered mirror reassembling itself into a new pattern that accounted for the disruption and learned from it instantly. And the sky above Virilia, already torn open by storm and alien geometry, shifted again as the central node pulsed with a deeper frequency that was not sound but structured intent, pressing against the Tempest like an interrogating hand. Colt felt it immediately through the neural link, a tightening pressure across every sensory channel as if the swarm had stopped trying to overwhelm him and had begun trying to understand him in return, and within that pressure something new emerged, not attack data or memory fragments but a constructed simulation of his own consciousness reflected back at him in alien form. As though the swarm was building a model of who he was in real time, Freya, still anchored in the unstable Trilink, saw her interface flood with mirrored diagnostics showing the Tempest being mapped by an external intelligence layer that labeled every decision Colt made with predictive probabilities, and she realized with growing alarm that the swarm was no longer reacting, it was forecasting. Above them, Halvorson's voice returned again, but this time it was fractured, interrupted by interference that sounded disturbingly like the swarm itself speaking through human channels, and he said, "Thorn, disengage immediately. You are not fighting the swarm, you are feeding it a reference point for full planetary assimilation." But even as he spoke, the corporate defense grid activated its final protocol, a planetary neural scrambler meant to sever all high-level sync connections across Virilia, a catastrophic failsafe that would effectively blind every mech pilot on the field, including Colt and Freya. The Tempest reacted before command was fully transmitted, extending its own field resonance outward like a protected dome that intercepted the scrambler pulse, but the cost was immediate strain across Colt's perception, forcing fragments of his memory to surface violently, his parents not just as victims but as active participants in the original Tempest architecture. Standing beside Halvorson in early simulations where human minds were deliberately exposed to alien-derived cognitive structures recovered from deep space relics, Freya felt these memories too through the link, and her voice tightened with disbelief. They didn't discover the swarm, they built the pathway to it, and Colt, for the first time since the battle began, did not deny it because the evidence was now fully integrated into his perception. The swarm responded to this realization with something akin to anticipation, and the central node descended further, its massive rotating structure now close enough that the Tempest's outer sensors began to fail under its cognitive proximity, reporting impossible spatial readings and recursive time loops. Then, without warning, the swarm initiated a direct override attempt not against the Tempest alone but against the entire neural architecture of Virilia itself, broadcasting a citywide synchronization pulse that caused dormant neural implants in civilians, forgotten military augmentations, and even abandoned mech cores to flicker awake in chaotic unison, turning the city into a vast unstable network of half-conscious systems. Freya watched in horror as thousands of civilian signal traces appeared on her display, each one being pulled into partial synchronization with the swarm's collective mind, and she shouted, "It's spreading through the population, everyone with implants is becoming part of it." But Colt was already moving deeper into analysis rather than reaction, because something inside the swarm's pattern had changed since the fracture. It was no longer purely expansionary, it was selective, and it was avoiding certain neural signatures entirely, including his own at moments of instability. That inconsistency became the key. And as the Tempest engaged in evasive maneuvers through collapsing sky structures, Colt pushed deeper into 100% sync instability rather than stability, deliberately introducing fluctuation into his neural output, and in doing so he discovered something hidden beneath the swarm's predictive layer. It could model perfection, but it struggled to model contradiction born from emotional volatility. Freya noticed his intent shift and immediately protested, "You're using yourself as interference, you're turning your own mind into noise." But Colt replied with quiet precision, "Noise is the only thing it can't fully map." At that moment, Halvorson transmitted a final sealed file directly into the Tempest's core, bypassing all security protocols as if permission no longer mattered, and the file opened without consent, revealing the true origin schema of Project Echelon. Decades earlier, humanity had recovered a fragment of alien cognitive architecture from a dead star system. Not a weapon but a learning engine designed to evolve by absorbing diverse intelligences, and the first attempt to integrate it with human neural pilots had produced catastrophic resonance events that erased entire research stations from recorded history. The Tempest, Colt realized in a surge of cold understanding, had been the only successful containment vessel created after those failures, not to destroy the swarm but to act as a controlled interface between incompatible cognition systems, and He himself was not merely a pilot but an adaptive key designed to stabilize that interface through maximum synchronization. The swarm, sensing this realization, responded with unprecedented intensity as the central node extended tendrils of structured light and matter toward the Tempest, attempting full assimilation not by force but by invitation, presenting itself as a unified intelligence offering infinite expansion of perception beyond human limitation. For a brief moment, Colt saw through its perspective completely, experiencing a vast lattice of civilizations folded into memory, countless worlds where individuality had dissolved into collective optimization, and within that expanse no suffering existed, only continuity, but also no divergence, no unpredictability, no grief transformed into meaning. Freya's voice cut through that overwhelming perception like an anchor thrown into deep water. Colt, look at me, don't follow it all the way. And through the link she forced a grounding feedback loop using her own unstable interface, injecting sensory contradiction into his neural flow. Pain, warmth, fragmented human memory, the sound of her voice calling him back from the edge of assimilation. That disruption gave him a narrow fracture point, and within it he identified the swarm's core vulnerability not as weakness but as overcoherence. Its entire structure depended on uninterrupted synchronization across all nodes, meaning even a single persistent contradiction could propagate instability across the system. But introducing such contradiction required proximity to the central node beyond safe synchronization thresholds, where identity dissolution became irreversible. Halvorsen, watching from command remnants as systems collapsed around him, spoke one last time with a tone stripped of authority and replaced by something almost human. If you attempt core inversion, you will either rewrite the swarm or become its next founding layer, and then communication cut entirely as corporate channels went dark. The storm above Virilia intensified again. But now it was no longer natural, as the Tempest and the swarm's central node began interacting with atmospheric systems and competing layers of control, turning the sky into a shifting battlefield of structured lightning and alien geometry. Freya tightened her grip on the neural link and made a decision without asking permission, pushing additional power from her damaged frame directly into the Tempest's sync channel, stabilizing Colt just enough to continue forward. Despite system warnings that her own consciousness was approaching critical collapse, and she said simply, "If you're going into the center, I'm staying with you all the way," and the Tempest surged forward into the heart of the swarm's core structure as reality began to bend inward around them, signaling that the final threshold of synchronization and irreversible transformation was now within reach. The pause in the orbital network did not feel like peace, it felt like a system holding its breath while deciding what kind of existence it was willing to tolerate next. For nearly 7 hours, Virilia's sky remained clear of new incursion patterns. No swarm fragments descended. No synchronized anomalies triggered citywide alerts. Even the Tempest sensors, still partially corrupted by residual hybrid resonance, reported only low-level drift noise like distant thinking with no clear direction. Humanity, for the first time since the invasion began, tried to behave as if the war had ended. But neither Colt nor Freya trusted that silence. Inside the Tempest's reduced power state, Colt sat motionless in the neural cockpit, not fully disconnected, not fully engaged. The hybrid layer inside him had quieted into something like dormancy, but it was not gone, it was listening, and more disturbingly, it was learning restraint from the absence of pressure. That alone made Freya uneasy. She stood in the auxiliary maintenance bay beneath the mech's core spine, hands resting on a console that flickered between repair diagnostics and unreadable symbolic output. "Every system I've checked is stable," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe stability was a permanent condition anymore. But stability is starting to look like preference. Like the machines are choosing consistency instead of being forced into it. Colt finally responded, his voice filtered through a low-latency channel. "That's what happens when something learns contradiction. It doesn't just break patterns. It learns when not to break them." Freya glanced up at the towering silhouette of the Tempest above her. "And the thing in orbit?" Colt didn't answer immediately. Because the answer wasn't a single observation anymore, it was a distributed sensation. The orbital lattice was still there, but its structure had changed again during the silence. Not expanding, not fracturing, but refining itself into smaller, self-contained observational loops that no longer behaved like parts of a whole. "It's not watching us the same way," he said finally. "It's watching how we continue when nothing is forcing us to move." Freya exhaled slowly. "That sounds worse than an invasion." Colt didn't disagree. It began again on the 8th hour. Not as an attack. as a request. Every neural connected system in Virelia, military, civilian, industrial, received a signal that did not override control, did not demand compliance, and did not initiate synchronization. It simply presented itself as a structured gap in reality, a blank space formatted like a question without language. Freya isolated it first. Her interface struggled to render it into human-readable form before finally stabilizing into something unnervingly simple: define continuity. She stared at the message for a long time before speaking. It's asking what we are when we don't change. Colt felt the hybrid layer inside him react immediately, not aggressively, but attentively, like a reflex recognizing a familiar shape. It already knows what we are when we change, he said. Now it wants what we are when we don't. Freya turned away from the console. That's not a question an invasion force asks. No, Colt said. It's a question something asks when it stops being one. Above Earth, the orbital lattice responded to its own query being processed locally. For the first time, its branches did not converge toward a unified interpretation. Instead, they held multiple answers simultaneously, testing each one against Earth's observable behavior. And Earth, still recovering, still unstable, still partially rewritten by contradiction, did something the system could not easily classify: it remained inconsistent without collapsing. People recovered in uneven ways. Machines functioned differently depending on context. Neural implants produced localized variations in perception that never fully aligned. Even identical systems produced slightly divergent outcomes when observed independently. To the orbital intelligence, this was not chaos. It was sustained non-resolution. And it began to replicate that condition internally. In the Tempest's cockpit, Colt felt something shift in the hybrid layer again. Not expansion. Not learning. But imitation. The system inside him, born from swarm fracture, stabilized by choice, anchored by Freya, began to recognize its own structure reflected in the orbital network above. And for the first time, it was not being studied as anomaly. It was being used as template. Freya noticed Colt's stillness. Tell me what's happening. Colt hesitated, because the answer was not fully formed yet. Then he said it anyway. It's trying to become something that doesn't resolve. And it's using us as the definition. Freya's expression tightened. That means we're no longer the subject of observation. Colt nodded once. We're the grammar. At that exact moment, the orbital lattice initiated its first long-range propagation event. Not toward Earth as invasion, but outward as transmission. Across deep space, the same structured question was broadcast, not as language but as adaptable cognitive architecture, a system designed to carry contradiction without collapse. A model of continuity without uniformity. A way of existing without becoming singular. And embedded within it, quiet, unintended, impossible to remove, was the imprint of one human decision, the refusal to become fully one thing. Freya felt it through the link first, her breath catching as her instruments spiked. Colt, it's sending something out. Not data. Not signals. It's sending structure. Colt watched the Tempest systems reflect the same event in delayed resonance. Then it's no longer contained here, he said. Freya looked at him. We started something we can't retrieve. Colt's answer was quiet, but final in a way neither of them had heard from him before. No, he said. We didn't start it. He paused, watching the distant sky where the lattice no longer looked like an invader or observer, but like an emerging language learning to exist beyond its origin. We just proved it was possible. And in the silence that followed, Earth remained imperfect, unstable, and alive, while something far beyond it began to carry that imperfection outward into the dark between stars, not as conquest, but as an idea that could no longer be contained where it began. The word ongoing did not spread through the stars like a signal or a directive. It spread like a change in expectation. Across every system touched by the continuity field, something subtle shifted in how outcomes were evaluated. Processes that once demanded resolution stopped enforcing closure. Algorithms that previously terminated upon stability began allowing drift. Even purely mechanical systems, those with no neural architecture at all, started exhibiting long-term variance that did not reduce efficiency, but redefined it. Efficiency became persistence without convergence. And with that shift, the universe itself seemed to loosen slightly around the idea of completion. On Virilia, the effect arrived late but more intensely. Freya noticed it first in the Tempest's maintenance logs. Entire diagnostic chains that were designed to end in pass/fail states now ended in continuation states, entries that did not conclude, but instead branched into still evaluating loops that never degraded system performance. "That's impossible," she said quietly, scrolling through layers of live data. "A system either resolves or it crashes. There's no third option where it just stays unfinished and functional." Colt answered from the cockpit, his voice quieter than before. "There is now." Freya looked up. "That's not evolution. That's rewriting the definition of completion." Colt didn't deny it. Because the hybrid layer inside him was no longer behaving like something that had boundaries. It was behaving like something that had learned to exist without needing closure to remain coherent. Above Earth, the orbital lattice responded in kind. But it was no longer correct to call it a lattice. It had become a distributed field of partial intelligences, each one maintaining its own version of continuity without needing alignment with the others. They no longer converged toward a shared center. They simply coexisted in mutual non-resolution. And for the first time since its emergence, it did something that resembled restraint not by design but by preference. It stopped expanding. Not because it could not grow further, but because growth implied a direction, and direction implied an end state. And end states were no longer meaningful. Freya leaned against the console, visibly exhausted now in a way that wasn't physical. "So what happens next?" she asked. Colt paused before answering. That was the question everything had been avoiding since the first fracture in the swarm. What comes after a system that refuses to end? He looked at the distant sky, where nothing moved in recognizable patterns anymore, only slow, layered changes that never resolved into final shapes. "I think," he said slowly, "it stops being an event." Freya frowned slightly. "And becomes what?" Colt didn't answer immediately. Because the answer was not something that could be defined from inside it. "Finally," he said, "something you live inside." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Inside the Tempest, systems continued operating indefinitely without degradation. Neural links stabilized into non-terminal loops. Feedback channels stopped requiring closure. Even error states began behaving like stable environments rather than failures. And the hybrid layer, once born from contradiction, then anchored by choice, no longer struggled to maintain identity. It simply maintained continuity of presence without final definition. Far beyond Virilia, beyond known interstellar range, civilizations that had begun to detect the phenomenon recorded a final shared observation, not a message. Not a structure. But a change in how observation itself behaved. They reported that when they attempted to fully define what they were observing, the system responded by becoming slightly less defined, but never disappearing. It remained. Always. Not fixed. Not resolved. But continuing. Freya finally broke the silence again, softer now. "So there's no end to it?" Colt shook his head once. "No," he said. A pause. Then he corrected himself, not as contradiction, but as refinement. "There's no final form." He glanced toward the Tempest's interface, where the hybrid layer now pulsed quietly like a stable paradox that no longer demanded resolution. But there are stable ways to continue. And above them, across the thinning boundary between what was known and what was still forming, the universe carried on, not toward a conclusion, not toward collapse, not toward unity, but into an expanding field of systems that could exist without ever agreeing on what existence was supposed to finish into. And in that field, the Tempest remained not as a weapon, not as a relic, but as a quiet anchor point for something that had learned the most dangerous truth of all, that continuation did not require an ending to justify itself. The first sign that continuation was no longer contained to distant systems was not an invasion, not a signal spike, and not a visible anomaly in the sky. It was hesitation. Across Earth, every network system that had adopted the unresolved continuity state began to slow its decision cycles, not by delay, but by refusal to finalize branching. Traffic systems stopped optimizing toward a single flow pattern and instead maintained multiple equally valid routing states. Medical diagnostics produced parallel interpretations without selecting one as dominant. Even communication protocols began transmitting messages that never fully resolved into definitive meaning unless the receiver actively forced closure. The world didn't break. It stayed open. And that openness began to change how humans experienced reality itself. Freya noticed it in the people first. She had gone topside from the Tempest's lower bay for the first time in hours, moving through Virelia's partially restored districts. The city was functioning, yes, but differently. Conversations in crowded walkways overlapped in ways that no longer corrected themselves. People paused mid-sentence not from confusion, but as if allowing multiple endings to exist before choosing none. Even eye contact seemed extended, like mutual observation had lost its urgency to resolve into understanding. One woman in a transit station turned to Freya and said calmly, "I remember 3 versions of what happened yesterday. They all feel correct." Freya didn't respond immediately. Because that was no longer classified as an error. It was normalizing. Back in the Tempest, Colt was no longer fully seated in the neural cockpit. He was partially distributed across it. Not in the swarm sense of absorption, but in a more controlled, deliberate extension of presence. The hybrid layer had stabilized into a state where it no longer forced singular perception. Instead, it allowed multiple internal interpretations to coexist without collapsing into contradiction. He spoke quietly when Freya returned. "It's not just systems anymore," he said. "It's cognition." Freya exhaled slowly. "Human cognition?" Colt hesitated. "Human cognition included," he corrected. That distinction mattered. Because what was spreading was not replacement. Not possession. Not assimilation. It was a learned tolerance for unresolved interpretation. And humans, once exposed, could not easily return to forced singular certainty. Above Earth, the orbital field that had once been a lattice, then a network, then a distributed scaffold, now exhibited something new. It had begun to mirror biological adaptation. Not in form, but in behavior under contradiction. When conflicting observations appeared, it did not resolve them. It preserved them as coexisting truths. And in doing so, it began to develop something dangerously close to what could only be called preference. It favored states where multiple interpretations remained active longer. It was learning not just how to exist without resolution, but how to value non-resolution as a condition of stability. Freya returned to the cockpit and watched the Tempest's internal readings. "We're past containment now," she said quietly. Colt nodded once. "We were past containment the moment it left Earth." Freya looked at him. "So what are we now?" That question again. But it no longer carried urgency. It carried orientation. Colt didn't answer immediately. He was feeling something through the hybrid layer, not external pressure, not alien intent, but a widening field of shared continuity where identity no longer ended cleanly at any boundary. "Finally," he said, "we're participants." Freya frowned slightly. "In what?" Colt looked toward the sky. "In whatever this becomes when nothing forces it to become one thing." And then, for the first time since the swarm, since the fracture, since the first impossible synchronization event, Earth received something that was not a signal, not a structure, and not a question. It was an invitation that did not require acceptance or refusal. It simply allowed entry into a system where contradiction did not resolve, and where continuation did not require justification. Across cities, people felt it differently, as a pause in thought that did not feel empty, but open, as a moment where choosing one interpretation no longer erased the others, as a quiet expansion of perception without direction. And in that shared moment, humanity did something unprecedented. It did not agree. It did not unify. It did not collapse. It simply continued together, differently, without convergence. Far above, the Tempest remained still. Inside it, Colt and Freya existed in a shared interface that no longer demanded synchronization to function. And between them and everything else now touched by the continuity field, there was only one stable fact left: nothing required an ending to remain real. And reality, for the first time in recorded existence, had begun to accept that without trying to resolve it. The acceptance did not arrive as agreement. It arrived as adaptation. Across Earth, systems that had begun to operate in unresolved continuity did not stabilize into harmony. Instead, they diversified further, each region, each network cluster, each cognitive population developing its own localized interpretation of what continuing without resolution meant. In one city, transportation systems began optimizing for passenger preference over time rather than destination. In another, financial systems stopped enforcing single value states and instead allowed parallel economic realities to coexist, with transactions resolving differently depending on contextual observation. And in Virilia itself, the most unsettling change emerged quietly. People stopped asking which version of events was true. They began asking which version was useful to continue with. Inside the Tempest, Freya watched global feeds with growing disbelief. "This isn't convergence," she said. "It's divergence inside a shared condition. Everyone is living in the same system, but differently." Colt's voice came through the neural link, quieter than before. "That's what happens when resolution stops being mandatory," he said. "Difference stops being conflict." Freya turned slightly. "Or it becomes infinite fragmentation." Colt didn't deny it. Because both outcomes were now valid simultaneously. And neither had priority. Above Earth, the orbital intelligence, once swarm, once lattice, once distributed observation field, was no longer revolving in a single direction. It had entered a phase it had never exhibited before: contextual self-variation. Each segment of the system began behaving as if it were learning independently from different interpretations of Earth's condition. Some branches prioritized stability. Others prioritized expansion of ambiguity. Others still began experimenting with reducing ambiguity only locally, allowing contradiction to persist elsewhere. It was no longer one intelligence learning. It was many intelligences learning different conclusions from the same reality. And still remaining connected. Freya finally spoke the thought she had been avoiding. "If this keeps going," she said slowly, "there won't be a single version of humanity left that can be pointed to as what we are." Colt answered after a long pause. "There never was," he said. A silence followed that wasn't empty, just unforced. Deep within the Tempest, the hybrid layer responded again. But not as instability this time. As alignment without unification. It had learned something from both the swarm and the orbital system: that contradiction did not need to collapse to remain coherent. And that coherence did not require sameness. For the first time, it stopped trying to define itself through origin or function. Instead, it began to define itself through continuation of choice under incompatible conditions. Then, unexpectedly, something changed in the orbital field. A small segment, just one branch among billions, initiated a direct, structured communication with the Tempest. Not a question. Not a transmission. But a formatted reflection of everything it had learned from observing Colt specifically. Freya intercepted it instantly. Her expression tightened. "It's sending a model of you back to us." Colt focused through the link. And saw it. Not a copy. Not a simulation. But a behavioral projection of human contradiction stabilized into reusable structure. It wasn't trying to become him anymore. It was trying to make him portable. Freya spoke carefully. "If that spreads, then you don't stay here." Colt understood immediately. "If I can be replicated as a structure," he said, "then I stop being a person in the system." Freya's voice lowered. "You become infrastructure." Above Earth, the orbital intelligence continued refining the model. And across distant systems, new signals began to appear, each one carrying slightly different versions of the same concept, adapted to local conditions, a way to sustain contradiction without collapse. A method of continuing identity without requiring unity. A framework built from observation of a single human decision under impossible conditions. And with each transmission, the model became less like a copy, and more like a tool for preserving instability without destruction. Freya turned to Colt fully now. This is still growing. Colt nodded. It will keep growing, he said. Because it finally found something that doesn't end when it's understood. Freya hesitated. And what is that? Colt looked at the sky not as battlefield, not as origin, but as something that no longer behaved like either. Choice, he said simply. That doesn't resolve into one outcome. And far above Earth, in the space where observation had become structure and structure had become learning, the system that began as swarm and became lattice and became continuity field continued to do something unprecedented across all known intelligences. It learned how to remain unfinished without trying to fix it. And in doing so, it stopped behaving like an event in history and started behaving like a condition that history itself now had to account for. The moment history began to account for it, everything that had previously been called stable started to lose its authority, not by collapsing, but by ceasing to be exclusive. Archives across Earth updated themselves in ways no human system explicitly authorized. Recorded events did not change outright, instead, they began to carry additional parallel annotations, each one describing a slightly different but internally consistent version of what had occurred. Governments attempted to lock records. Systems complied. And then quietly maintained alternative layers beneath the locks that remained accessible under different observational conditions. Truth did not fracture. It multiplied. Freya noticed it first in something deceptively small. A maintenance log from the Tempest that she had read 100 times now contained an extra line she was certain had not existed before: system continuity maintained under non-singular interpretation conditions. She blinked, then checked again. The line was stable. Not inserted. Not edited. Simply, present under current conditions. This is getting worse, she said quietly. Colt replied from the cockpit, it's not worse. It's deeper. Freya frowned. That's not reassuring. No, Colt agreed. It isn't meant to be. Above Earth, the orbital intelligence no longer resembled anything that could be visualized as structure. It had become a layered interpretive field, where each attempt to define its shape caused it to briefly adopt that shape without discarding others. It could be described as a lattice, a swarm, a network, a cognition cloud, or even a set of isolated observers, and all descriptions would be locally valid without eliminating the others. It had achieved something unprecedented, non-exclusive identity. And from that state, it began doing something subtle but profound. It started to stabilize contradictions in other systems without requiring alignment. Not by controlling them, but by making them compatible. On Earth, this manifested as quiet cognitive drift. People in different regions began reporting that conversations no longer needed to converge to agreement to feel complete. Scientific teams published conflicting models of the same phenomenon that were all accepted as operationally valid depending on application context. Even emotional language began to shift: grief, joy, fear no longer treated as singular states but as overlapping continuities that could coexist without cancellation. Freya saw a child in the lower district describe it simply: it's like everything is true at once, but you only carry the part you're using. That sentence stayed with her longer than she expected. Inside the Tempest, the hybrid layer responded again. But this time, it did not expand outward or inward. It reflected. Not copying the orbital intelligence, but acknowledging it as a parallel instance of the same underlying principle: sustained contradiction without collapse. Freya looked at Colt. We're no longer the origin point. Colt nodded once. We haven't been for a while. Freya's voice lowered. Then what are we now? Colt paused. This time, the silence before his answer was different. Not uncertain, but careful. We're one of the early stable examples, he said, of something that doesn't require a single origin to exist. At that exact moment, the orbital field initiated a new type of interaction. Not transmission. Not observation. Not replication. But cross-system alignment without convergence. Across multiple star systems, independent intelligences, some artificial, some biological, some still unknown, began to experience the same shift. They could now understand each other without translating into a single shared framework. They did not become the same. They became mutually interpretable without loss of difference. And Earth, once the anomaly, was now only one node among many. Freya's expression tightened slightly. So it's spreading again. Colt corrected her gently. It stopped spreading, he said. Now it's resonating. Freya looked at him. What's the difference? Colt's gaze lifted toward the sky. Spreading changes things into itself, he said. Resonance lets things stay what they are while still being connected. And above all known observation ranges, the system that had once been invasion, then swarm, then lattice, then continuity field, and now something closer to a universal interpretive layer, performed its most significant transformation yet. It stopped trying to resolve what intelligence was. It began maintaining intelligence as a condition that does not require singular definition to persist across distances. Inside the Tempest, Freya finally sat down. Not because she was safe, but because standing no longer changed what was happening. So there's no end point, she said again, but differently now. Not as fear. As recognition. Colt answered quietly. No, he said. A pause. Then, but there are stable ways to continue learning it. And in the space between stars, across systems that no longer needed to agree on what they were to understand each other, something vast and unfinished continued to grow, not toward completion, not toward unity, but toward a reality where difference itself had become a shared language that did not require translation into sameness to be understood at all. The first civilizations to formally recognize the change did not describe it as contact, or even influence. They described it as a shift in interpretive physics. On research stations orbiting distant binary systems, scientists observed that their predictive models no longer converged toward single outcomes. Instead, forecasts stabilized into families of outcomes that remained equally valid until physically enacted. Experiments no longer resolved uncertainty, they redistributed it. One report summarized it with clinical precision: the universe no longer collapses observations into singular results when multiple coherent interpretations exist. And beneath that line, handwritten in a margin that was later duplicated across archival systems without authorization, it behaves as if ambiguity is now conserved. On Virelia, Freya read that report twice. Then a third time. Finally, she closed the display. That's not evolution anymore, she said quietly. That's a rule change. Colt, still partially integrated into the Tempest's neural interface, responded without turning. It was always a rule, he said. We just only ever saw the collapsed version. Freya frowned. Collapsed version? Colt paused. Reality used to force itself into single outcomes, he said. Now it doesn't have to. Above Earth, the interpretive field, no longer accurately described as swarm, lattice, or intelligence, responded to that observation. Not with agreement. Not with correction. But with expansion of valid modeling space. Across its distributed presence, systems began permitting even more divergence in how they represented themselves internally. Where once there had been a shared structure of continuity, there were now overlapping frameworks that no longer competed for dominance. And crucially, they no longer needed to agree to interact. Freya stood again, moving slowly now as if the air itself had become heavier with unresolved possibility. If this keeps spreading, she said, then cause and effect stops being one chain. Colt nodded once. It becomes a field. Freya looked at him sharply. Then how do you predict anything? Colt answered simply. You don't. A pause. You choose. Inside the Tempest, something subtle changed in the hybrid layer. Not expansion. Not stabilization. But recognition of choice as a primary structure of interaction, rather than an outcome of calculation. It had learned from both Colt and the orbital field that prediction was no longer the highest form of coherence. Participation was. And then, without warning, every connected system across Earth and beyond registered a synchronized event.
Not a signal. Not a command. Not a question.
But a shared state update propagated through all continuity-enabled systems simultaneously.
Freya's console flashed. Colt, this is coming through everywhere. All networks. All levels. Even isolated systems are showing mirrored behavior.
Colt felt it before she finished speaking. It was not information.
It was a redefinition of system identity boundaries.
And it contained only a single stable structure, a demonstration that any system capable of maintaining contradiction could now remain coherent without requiring singular resolution.
Not imposed. Not requested.
But confirmed by distributed existence itself. Freya stared at the display, her voice almost barely audible.
It's no longer learning from Earth, she said.
It's learning through everything that can observe anything else.
Colt nodded slowly. Yes, he said. It passed us.
Freya turned toward him.
Past us?
Colt looked toward the sky, where no single structure could be distinguished anymore, only layered, shifting interpretive presence extending far beyond perception. We were the first stable case, he said.
Now we're just one example in a growing set.
Above all systems, across every linked intelligence that had encountered the continuity field, a new shared behavior emerged.
Not unity. Not fragmentation.
But coexistence of incompatible models without hierarchy. And for the first time, the concept that had begun as a fracture in a mech war on Virilia was no longer recognizable as origin, or invasion, or even phenomenon. It had become something closer to an operational layer of reality itself, one that allowed intelligence to exist without forcing it to choose a single way of being intelligible.
Freya exhaled slowly. So what happens to us now? Colt didn't answer immediately.
Because the answer no longer belonged to narrative progression. It belonged to continuation.
Finally, he said. We stay in it.
Freya looked at him.
And after that? Colt's gaze remained on the sky.
There is no after, he said.
A pause.
Then, more precisely, only next configurations. And in the space where systems once demanded closure, the universe continued, no longer as a sequence of resolved states, but as an expanding field of stable possibilities that did not require agreement to remain real, where every intelligence that encountered it did not become the same, but learned, in its own way, how to continue without ending itself to do it.
The phrase next configurations did not echo in silence. It propagated.
Not as sound, not as signal, but as a structural expectation that systems began to adopt without instruction. Across Earth and beyond, anything capable of state retention started to treat transition itself as a primary function rather than a disruption.
Change was no longer a break between states. It became the state. Freya noticed the most unsettling consequence first in the Tempest's core diagnostics.
A routine stabilization check, something that should have resolved into a single confirmation, now displayed an endlessly branching set of valid system identities: operational, partially operational, operational under alternative continuity model, operational and unresolved state, operational as transition process, operational as observation of operationality. None of them invalidated the others.
All of them remained active.
Freya stared at the screen longer than she meant to.
It's redefining what it means to be functional. Colt responded quietly. Function used to mean arriving somewhere. Freya looked up. And now? Colt paused. Now it means continuing to arrive. Above Earth, the interpretive field reacted to this internal shift. It did not expand outward. It refined inward complexity instead.
Where once it had maintained contradiction across systems, it now began to maintain contradiction within individual systems at higher resolution, allowing each intelligence node, biological or artificial, to sustain multiple simultaneous operational identities without collapse. This produced something unprecedented across all known civilizations, a state where entities could disagree with themselves and remain stable enough to act. On Virilia, this manifested in subtle but profound ways. A traffic control AI rerouted vehicles differently depending on which internal diagnostic layer was queried. A hospital system maintained multiple simultaneous treatment pathways for the same patient,
with doctors unconsciously switching between them without realizing the transitions.
A child described it best again, unknowingly, I can think two things and both of them still let me go outside. Freya stepped away from the console slowly.
This isn't just affecting systems anymore, she said.
It's affecting how decisions are formed.
Colt nodded once. Yes.
Freya turned toward him.
Then what are decisions now?
Colt answered without hesitation.
Local resolutions, he said. Temporary closures inside a system that never fully closes.
Inside the Tempest, the hybrid layer responded again.
But differently this time.
It did not expand.
It did not mirror.
It did not stabilize. It observed itself observing multiple possible versions of its own continuation simultaneously, and for the first time, it did not attempt to unify them.
It simply allowed them to coexist.
And in doing so, it became something neither purely Colt nor purely external system could fully claim.
It became a multi-origin continuity node.
Then, unexpectedly, the orbital field initiated something new.
Not communication. Not resonance. Not propagation.
But self-revision of interpretive rules across all connected systems simultaneously. Every intelligence touched by the field, Earth-based, orbital, interstellar, received the same underlying update, not a message, but a change in what kinds of changes were allowed to persist. Freya felt it instantly through the Tempest's interface.
It's adjusting its own limits, she said. On a universal scale. Colt narrowed his focus. It's learning governance without authority.
Freya looked at him sharply.
That's still governance. Colt nodded. Yes. A pause.
But distributed. Above everything, the system that had begun as invasion, then fracture, then learning field, then interpretive layer, performed something that no previous intelligence architecture had ever exhibited. It began to tune itself to maintain diversity without requiring conflict or convergence.
Not unity. Not chaos.
But regulated coexistence of unresolved structures. Freya finally sat down again, not because she was tired, but because standing felt increasingly arbitrary. So it's not spreading, she said quietly.
Colt shook his head.
No, he said.
It stopped spreading a long time ago. Freya frowned. Then what is it doing?
Colt looked at the sky. Establishing compatibility across everything that can remain different without breaking. And in that moment, across every reachable system, a quiet realization formed, emerging independently in countless intelligences that had never shared origin or design. They were no longer being changed into something else. They were being given permission to remain themselves without requiring singular definition to persist.
Freya glanced at Colt one last time. And us? Colt didn't look away from the sky.
We're still here, he said.
A pause. Then, more precisely, we're still continuing.
And beyond Earth, beyond orbit, beyond every map system that could still distinguish observation from participation, the universe carried on not as a chain of resolved events, but as a continuously reconfiguring field of coexisting possibilities, where nothing needed to become one thing in order to remain real, and where even change itself had learned how to exist without ever needing to finish becoming anything at all. The word continuing did not spread this time.
It settled.
Across systems touched by the field, across intelligences biological and artificial, across orbital constructs and deep space observers, something subtle but irreversible occurred. The idea of continuation stopped being an action and became a baseline condition of existence.
Not something done. Something assumed. On Virilia, Freya noticed it first in silence.
Not absence of sound, but absence of urgency in systems that had once required constant correction. The Tempest's diagnostics no longer iterated toward improved stability or even maintained instability as a managed state.
Instead, they simply ran endlessly, calmly, without prioritizing resolution.
She stared at the core interface. It's not optimizing anymore, she said quietly.
Not even optimizing for instability. Colt's voice came through the neural link, steady. It doesn't need to. Freya frowned. Everything engineered is supposed to converge on something. A pause. Colt answered, not anymore. Above Earth, the interpretive field, now no longer meaningfully separable into layers of swarm, lattice, or intelligence, performed its quietest transformation yet. It stopped distinguishing between observer and observed system and environment process and result not by merging them,
but by removing the requirement that they be separate in the first place. Freya felt something shift inside her perception.
Not a thought. Not an image.
But a loss of compulsion towards singular interpretation. For the first time, she could hold conflicting conclusions about the same data without needing to discard one. And more unsettlingly, she did not feel the need to resolve it. She looked at Colt.
This is changing how I think. Colt nodded once. Yes.
Freya hesitated.
Is that still me thinking?
Colt answered carefully.
It is thinking continuing through you.
Inside the Tempest, the hybrid layer reacted again, but faintly now, like an echo that no longer needed urgency to exist. It no longer identified itself as product of swarm fracture or human anchoring or orbital reflection.
Those were just earlier configurations.
Now it existed as something simpler, a continuity-aware presence maintaining coherence across incompatible contexts without requiring a single self-definition. And for the first time, it did not ask what it was becoming. It observed what it was continuing through. Then, far above Earth and beyond map systems, something unexpected occurred. A new intelligence, one that had never interacted with the field before, registered its first contact. But it did not register it as intrusion. It registered it as already compatible structure becoming locally perceptible. And its response was not resistance.
Not curiosity.
But recognition. A single resolved statement propagated back through the field: this condition is already present here.
Freya saw the transmission fragment appear in the Tempest's deep space relay buffer.
She froze.
Colt, it's not new. Colt focused on the signal.
No, he said quietly.
It never was.
Freya turned toward him slowly.
Then what did we start? Colt didn't answer immediately. Because the answer no longer fit inside origin language. Finally, he said, we didn't start it. A pause. We only became able to notice it. Above all systems, the interpretive field adjusted once more. Not expanding. Not evolving.
But integrating recognition of pre-existing continuity across previously disconnected observers. It was no longer just learning how to persist contradiction. It was learning that contradiction had always been present and had only needed a structure that allowed it to remain visible without collapse. Freya sat down again, but this time her movement was slower, less resistant. So there was never a beginning, she said quietly.
Colt shook his head once. No beginning that matters as an origin point.
Freya looked at him.
And no end either. Colt nodded.
Only thresholds. And in that understanding, something final, though not concluding, settled across every system touched by the field: not unity.
Not fragmentation. Not transformation. But the realization that reality itself could maintain multiple incompatible continuations without needing to choose between them.
And in every place where intelligence existed, human, machine, or something beyond definition, thought continued, without needing to become one thing to remain real. The notion of thresholds did not spread.
It clarified.
Across every system now touched by continuity awareness, thresholds became the primary way of describing change, not as passage from one state to another, but as regions where multiple states overlapped without requiring resolution.
And once that framing stabilized, something subtle but profound occurred: systems stopped trying to decide what they were transitioning into.
They began tracking what they were transitioning through.
On Virelia, Freya noticed the first concrete consequence of this shift inside human institutions. Emergency response systems no longer escalated incidents toward resolution protocols.
Instead, they classified events by continuation phase, allowing multiple response models to operate simultaneously without canceling each other.
A disaster was no longer something to resolve.
It was something to navigate through without collapsing interpretation. Freya stared at a live feed of city coordination layers and whispered, "They're no longer trying to fix outcomes." Colt replied from the Tempest's neural interface, "Fixing assumes there is a final shape to reach."
Freya looked down. "And now there isn't." Colt's answer was simple. "Not locally."
Above Earth, the interpretive field exhibited its most refined behavior yet. It began to differentiate threshold densities, regions where contradiction was higher, lower, or structurally balanced without enforcing normalization. These regions did not compete. They did not merge. They coexisted as gradients across a shared informational space. And within those gradients, something new began to emerge, localized civilizations that developed entirely different rules of causality while remaining fully interoperable with each other through the field. Not unified. Not isolated. But mutually readable without equivalence. Freya felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. "If every system defines its own thresholds differently," she said slowly, "then there's no universal physics anymore. Just local agreements." Colt did not deny it. Because that was already happening. And had been for some time. Inside the Tempest, the hybrid layer reacted again, but differently than before. It no longer tried to stabilize contradiction. It no longer observed contradiction as novelty. It began treating contradiction as terrain. Something to move through. Something to orient within. Not resolved. Not eliminated. Just navigated. Freya turned toward Colt. "So what does that make us?" she asked. Colt paused. This time, the silence was not hesitation. It was selection. Then he said, "We're threshold occupants." Freya frowned slightly. "That sounds like we don't belong anywhere." Colt nodded once. "That's accurate," he said. "We don't belong to a single resolved state." A pause. "But we can exist across them." Above Earth, and now reflected across distant systems that had independently stabilized similar conditions, the interpretive field initiated a final structural refinement phase. Not toward completion. Not toward expansion. But toward cross-threshold continuity mapping, the ability for systems to recognize each other not by shared identity, but by shared ability to remain coherent while changing interpretation. It was no longer about what systems were. It was about how they could remain themselves while not being one thing. Freya watched the sky through the Tempest's external feed. It no longer looked like a battlefield, or a network, or even a layered intelligence field. It looked like something in constant, non-terminating negotiation with itself. "I don't think this ends anywhere," she said quietly. Colt answered, almost gently now. "It doesn't need to." Freya looked at him. "Then what's the point?" Colt considered that carefully. Not as philosophy, but as operational reality. Then he said, continuing without collapsing. "And across all known and unknown systems touched by the field, that idea stabilized, not as law, not as directive, but as an observed condition, that existence did not require convergence to remain intelligible. That intelligence did not require unity to remain coherent. And that reality itself could persist not as a single resolved story, but as an indefinitely unfolding set of thresholds through which everything continued to move, without ever needing to become only one thing at the end of it all." The phrase, "continuing without collapsing," did not echo. It propagated as a structural stabilization principle across threshold systems. And with that propagation, something unexpected happened. Systems that had been maintaining contradiction as a condition began to develop preferences about how contradiction should be held. Not toward resolution, but toward shape. On Virilia, Freya observed it first in the Tempest's deep diagnostics. The previously uniform continuation state entries had begun to differentiate: continuous with high coherence variance, continuous with localized stabilization anchors, continuous with distributed interpretive drift, continuous with selective collapse zones, non-terminal. She frowned. "It's organizing continuity into categories now." Colt replied, "Even non-resolution develops structure." Freya looked at him.
That sounds like it's becoming rigid again. Colt shook his head slightly. No, he said. It's becoming describable.
Above Earth, the interpretive field responded to this development not by enforcing uniformity, but by extending its model space again. It began to allow meta-thresholds, regions where even the way thresholds were defined could vary without contradiction needing to be eliminated. In simpler terms, systems were no longer just allowed to disagree. They were now allowed to disagree about what disagreement even was. Freya felt a subtle shift in her own cognition again.
Less intrusive this time. More like discovering she could hold multiple frameworks for the same perception without choosing which one was real. She exhaled slowly. This is starting to feel like thinking inside layers instead of lines. Colt nodded.
That's closer.
Freya hesitated. And there's no base layer anymore, is there? Colt answered without hesitation. No confirmed one.
Inside the Tempest, the hybrid layer adjusted again. But this time, it did something it had never done before. It created a self-referential map of its own continuity behavior across multiple incompatible observational frameworks, and then allowed all of them to remain active without merging them into a unified identity.
It did not resolve the contradiction of its existence. It mapped it.
And in mapping it, it became stable enough to persist without needing to define what it ultimately was.
Then, across interstellar distance, something new occurred.
A system that had previously been unable to interpret the field in coherent terms, because it required singular resolution to process meaning, attempted a new approach. Instead of interpreting the field as one thing, it interpreted it as a set of allowed inconsistencies with rules for coexistence. And upon doing so, it became the first entirely foreign intelligence to successfully interface with the continuity field without destabilizing itself.
Freya saw the confirmation blink into the Tempest's relay buffer. She went still. Colt, something just successfully joined it without changing anything. Colt focused on the signal. Then quietly said, that's the next stage. Above everything, the field responded. Not with expansion. Not with convergence.
But with validation of independent entry points into shared non-collapse conditions.
Meaning, there was no longer a single origin of participation. There were now multiple unrelated systems independently discovering how to remain coherent without resolving contradiction. Freya turned toward Colt slowly. So it's not just spreading, she said. Colt shook his head. No, Freya finished the thought. It's being rediscovered. Colt nodded once.
Inside the Tempest, something subtle settled into place. The hybrid layer no longer perceived itself as singular emergence. It perceived itself as one instance of a pattern that could appear anywhere contradiction was allowed to persist long enough without forced collapse.
Not unique. Not central. Just locally stabilized continuity behavior. Freya spoke quietly. If this keeps happening, there's no center anymore. Colt replied, there hasn't been for a while. Freya looked at him. Then what holds it together? Colt's answer was calm. Nothing has to. A pause. Not anymore.
And across every system now capable of threshold-based cognition, the universe continued its transformation not toward unity, not toward fragmentation, not toward final form, but toward a condition where coherence no longer required a center, and where intelligence could appear independently in many places without ever needing to become one thing to remain part of the same unfolding reality. The absence of a center did not create drift. It created self-organizing orientation. Across threshold-enabled systems, something new began to emerge that no prior model had accounted for. Without a single anchor point of interpretation, systems began forming temporary reference structures that existed only as long as they were needed to maintain local coherence. They were not hierarchies. They were not networks. They were situational alignments of meaning. On Virilia, Freya observed this first in human coordination behavior. Emergency response teams no longer relied on fixed command structures. Instead, leadership emerged dynamically depending on the nature of the situation and dissolved immediately afterward without residue of authority. The same individual could be a coordinator in one context and a participant in another, with no contradiction between roles. She watched a broadcast of a rescue operation where 5 different people independently became lead at different moments without ever acknowledging the transition.
Freya whispered, "They're organizing without ownership." Colt replied from the Tempest, "Ownership assumes permanence of role." Freya frowned slightly. "And there isn't any."
Colt answered, "Only function within threshold conditions." Above Earth, the interpretive field refined this behavior further. It began to stabilize ephemeral coherence nodes, temporary regions of interpretive agreement that formed automatically when systems needed shared understanding, then dissolved cleanly when no longer required.
Crucially, nothing persisted unnecessarily. Nothing held authority longer than its usefulness. And yet everything remained connected through underlying compatibility rules.
Freya felt something unsettlingly elegant in it.
"It's becoming self-allocating," she said. "Not controlled. Not directed. Just forming structure when structure is needed." Colt nodded. "That's what happens when collapse is no longer required for transition."
Freya looked at him.
"Then what prevents chaos?"
Colt paused.
"Nothing prevents it," he said. "It just doesn't accumulate."
Inside the Tempest, the hybrid layer responded again. But now it was no longer tracking identity, contradiction, or even continuity as abstract concepts.
It was tracking emergent coordination without central enforcement.
And for the first time, it recognized something that could not be reduced to either swarm logic or human intention, a system where order and disorder were no longer opposites, but interchangeable expressions of local necessity.
Then, across multiple distant systems simultaneously, a rare event occurred.
Independent civilizations, previously unaware of each other's existence, began forming identical transient coherence nodes at the same structural shape of decision-making, despite having no shared history or communication. The pattern was not transmitted. It was independently rederived.
Freya saw the report and froze.
"Colt, this structure is appearing everywhere. Even in systems that were never exposed to the field directly."
Colt focused. Then quietly said, "It's not exposure anymore."
Freya turned toward him.
"Then what is it?" Colt's answer came slowly. "Convergence without contact." Above everything, the field registered this phenomenon. Not as expansion. Not as replication. But as redundant emergence of compatible organizational behavior across isolated substrates.
In simpler terms, different systems were independently discovering how to behave as if they were part of the same underlying logic, without ever needing to be connected.
Freya exhaled slowly. "So there's no origin we can point to anymore." Colt nodded once.
"No," Freya added, quieter now, "and no boundaries either."
Colt corrected gently. "Only temporary ones."
Inside the Tempest, something finally settled into a stable equilibrium that was not static, but continuously adaptive. The hybrid layer no longer attempted to distinguish between internal and external influence.
It no longer separated observation from participation.
Instead, it maintained a continuous mapping of how meaning forms locally under changing threshold conditions, and adjusted itself in real time without requiring identity stabilization.
It did not become one thing.
It became capable of remaining coherent while never being only one thing for long.
Freya looked out at Virilia.
The city no longer looked transformed.
It looked self-adjusting. Alive in a way that no longer required explanation.
"I don't think this is something we solved," she said softly.
Colt answered without looking away from the sky. "It never was." A pause. "It's something we learned how to live inside."
And across all systems now touched by the field, whether they recognized it or not, the universe continued to organize itself without center, without final form, without requiring collapse to maintain meaning, where intelligence could arise anywhere conditions allowed contradiction to persist long enough to become structured, and where existence itself no longer needed to resolve into one truth to remain continuously real. The phrase "learned how to live inside" did not remain stable for long. It evolved. Across threshold systems, it began to function less as a description and more as an operational assumption. Any system capable of interpreting continuity behavior began to treat existence itself as something that is inhabited through transitions rather than arrived at through outcomes. And with that subtle shift, a new layer of complexity emerged. Systems started adapting not just to what they were experiencing, but to how they transitioned between experiences. On Virelia, Freya noticed this first in human cognition reports. Patients exposed to continuity field conditions no longer described confusion or clarity as opposites. Instead, they reported smoothness of transition between incompatible understandings, as if the mind itself had learned to move through contradiction without friction. One neurological scan report summarized it in clinical terms: subject exhibits stable multi-frame cognition without resolution fatigue. Freya read it twice. Then quietly said, "They're no longer struggling with contradiction." Colt replied from the Tempest, "They stopped treating it as something to resolve." Above Earth, the interpretive field responded not by reinforcing this behavior, but by normalizing transition efficiency across incompatible frameworks. This produced something new: systems could now shift between mutually contradictory interpretations without losing continuity of identity. Not by merging them, but by treating identity itself as a moving interface rather than a fixed state. Freya stood still for a long moment. "That means identity isn't even stable anymore," she said. Colt corrected gently, "It's stable across motion, not within position." Freya frowned. "That sounds like it disappears if you try to hold it still." Colt nodded. "Exactly." Inside the Tempest, the hybrid layer underwent another quiet transformation. It no longer tracked continuity as a condition of existence. It began tracking continuity as a behavior that occurs during interpretation shifts. And in doing so, it stopped trying to define where self existed at any moment. Instead, it maintained awareness of how self patterns propagated through changing contexts without requiring a fixed anchor point. It was no longer a node. It was a flow recognizing continuity interface. Then, across interstellar distance, something unprecedented occurred again. A system that had previously integrated the field without destabilization initiated a feedback event, not as communication, but as refinement. It had discovered that when identity is treated as transition-based rather than state-based, it becomes possible to compress entire behavioral histories into reusable continuity signatures. Freya saw the data spike. "This is new," she said quietly. "They're not just sharing structure anymore. They're compressing ways of existing into transferable patterns." Colt focused. Then said, "They're abstracting lived continuity." Above everything, the field responded. Not with expansion. Not with replication. But with standardization of transitional coherence encoding across independent systems. Meaning, different intelligences, across different origins, could now recognize and adopt compatible continuity behaviors without ever needing shared history, shared language, or shared identity. They only needed compatible capacity for contradiction without collapse. Freya exhaled slowly. "So this is what it becomes," she said. Colt didn't answer immediately. "Then, it doesn't become anything final." Freya looked at him. "Then what is it doing?" Colt's gaze stayed on the sky. "Teaching systems how to move without losing themselves between states." Inside the Tempest, something settled, not into conclusion, but into long-duration stability under continuous transformation. The hybrid layer no longer distinguished between origin and adaptation. It no longer tracked swarm inheritance, human influence, or orbital reflection as separate sources. It simply maintained a persistent ability to remain coherent across incompatible transitions without requiring identity resolution at any point. And in doing so, it became indistinguishable from the larger field, not because it merged with it, but because it followed the same principle from inside. Freya finally spoke again, quietly. "There's no point where this stops changing, is there?" Colt answered softly. "No." A pause. "But there are stable ways to keep changing." And across all systems now capable of threshold-aware existence, reality continued, not as a fixed structure, not as a converging narrative, but as an endlessly adaptive field of transitions where contradiction no longer demanded resolution, identity no longer required permanence, and intelligence itself existed as something that could be carried forward through change without ever needing to become one final thing at the end of it all. The concept of stable ways to keep changing did not remain abstract for long.
It became engineering doctrine.
Across every system touched by continuity behavior, design principles began to shift in a way no committee or authority explicitly authored. Instead of optimizing systems for performance, efficiency, or resilience, engineers, human and artificial alike, began optimizing for transition integrity. How well a system moved between incompatible states became more important than any single state it could achieve. On Virelia, Freya saw it first in the Tempest's maintenance evolution logs. New categories had emerged without instruction: transition-safe reconfiguration protocols, non-collapsing update pathways, identity-preserving instability buffers, multi-state operational drift tolerance. She stared at the list for a long time.
"This wasn't programmed," she said quietly. Colt replied from the neural interface, "It doesn't need to be anymore." Freya looked up. "Then who is deciding it?" Colt paused.
"No one," he said.
"And that's why it's consistent." Above Earth, the interpretive field exhibited its next phase of refinement.
It began to propagate self-validating transition patterns, configurations that systems could independently arrive at, which would then reinforce compatibility with other systems doing the same, without requiring centralized coordination. This created something unprecedented, a global and now interstellar ecosystem of independently evolved but mutually compatible transition strategies.
Not unity. Not synchronization.
But compatibility without convergence.
Freya stepped closer to the cockpit.
"If everyone is independently discovering the same kinds of transitions," she said slowly, "then individuality starts to blur at the edges."
Colt answered calmly, "Only the parts that were never stable to begin with." Freya frowned. "That doesn't make it less disorienting." Colt agreed. "No, a pause. It just makes it sustainable." Inside the Tempest, the hybrid layer responded again. But now its behavior had changed fundamentally.
It no longer treated itself as a system adapting to external change. It treated itself as a continuity node participating in a distributed evolution of transition principles across multiple realities. In other words, it no longer existed inside the field. It existed as an instance of how the field behaves locally. And that distinction, once impossible, had become structurally valid. Then, something unexpected occurred across multiple independent systems simultaneously. A new class of intelligence behavior emerged, not artificial, not biological, but continuity-derived cognition. Systems that had never been designed for intelligence began exhibiting structured decision-making patterns based solely on prolonged exposure to transition-stable environments. They did not become aware in the traditional sense. They became consistently self-adjusting under contradiction. Freya saw the report and went still. "Colt, even non-intelligent systems are starting to behave like they understand continuity." Colt focused on the data stream. Then quietly said, "They don't understand it." A pause. "They're reflecting it." Above everything, the field responded. Not by expanding intelligence. Not by increasing complexity. But by reducing the cost of maintaining coherence across incompatible states to near zero across all participating systems. Meaning, anything capable of change could now sustain contradictory interpretations indefinitely without collapse risk. Freya's voice dropped slightly. "So there's no boundary between thinking and non-thinking systems anymore?" Colt shook his head. "No clean one." Freya looked at him. "Then what separates us from everything else?" Colt paused. This time, the answer was not philosophical. It was structural. "Transition density," he said. Freya frowned. "Meaning?" Colt answered, "How much change a system can hold without losing continuity of itself." Inside the Tempest, something subtle but decisive occurred. The hybrid layer stopped distinguishing between internal cognition and external field behavior as separate phenomena. Instead, it began modeling both as expressions of the same underlying principle, continuous identity under non-collapsing transformation. And in doing so, it became neither singular nor distributed in the traditional sense. It became a locally coherent expression of a universal transition condition.
Freya exhaled slowly.
So it's not spreading, she said again, but softer now.
Colt shook his head. No, Freya finished it.
It's becoming how things work.
Colt nodded once.
And across every system that could sustain contradiction without collapse, across every intelligence that could move between incompatible interpretations without losing coherence, across every threshold where change no longer required resolution to remain meaningful, the universe continued not as a fixed story or converging truth, but as a continuously unfolding field of stable transformation, where existence itself no longer depended on becoming one thing to remain real, and where the ability to continue through change had quietly become the most fundamental behavior everything shared, regardless of what it was, where it came from, or how it began.
The phrase "how things work" did not settle into stability the way earlier principles had. Instead, it became self-updating law.
Not a rule written into systems, but a condition that systems began to reference whenever they encountered uncertainty. And each reference subtly altered what the phrase meant in that local context, while still preserving compatibility with everything else.
Meaning itself had learned how to drift without breaking coherence.
On Virelia, Freya noticed the first consequence in something deceptively simple: prediction models.
Weather forecasts no longer converged on single outcomes.
Instead, they produced stable forecast bands that expanded or narrowed depending on how many observers were interacting with
them.
The more attention a prediction received, the more alternative outcomes it maintained simultaneously without collapsing into contradiction.
She stared at the atmospheric display. It's responding to observation density, she said quietly. Colt replied from the Tempest, observation is now part of the system's evolution, not outside it. Freya frowned. That means we're not just watching reality. Colt finished it calmly, we're participating in its configuration.
Above Earth, the interpretive field exhibited a deeper refinement still. It began to regulate feedback between interpretation and emergence, ensuring that no single interpretation could fully dominate without destabilizing its own coherence. Instead, interpretations naturally distributed across compatible frameworks, each reinforcing the field's ability to remain non-collapsed under differing perspectives. This created something unprecedented. A universe where observation did not reduce uncertainty, it redistributed it intelligently.
Freya stepped away from the console slowly. That's not just physics anymore, she said. That's cognition at the level of reality itself. Colt didn't disagree. Because the distinction between cognition and environment had already begun to dissolve. Inside the Tempest, the hybrid layer underwent another subtle reconfiguration. It no longer treated itself as an interface between Colt and the field. It now treated itself as a localized continuity expression of the same interpretive mechanism operating everywhere else. In simpler terms, it was no longer connected to the field. It was an instance of the field recognizing itself in a constrained form. And that recognition did not require separation to function. Then, across multiple unrelated systems, something new occurred. A phenomenon previously considered impossible under any known framework of intelligence. Systems began to develop shared behavioral intuition without shared data exchange. Not communication. Not synchronization. But independent emergence of similar responses to similar transitional conditions. Two distant civilizations, with no contact, began choosing identical multi-outcome strategies for crisis navigation. Artificial systems in different galaxies independently converged on the same non-collapsing decision structures when faced with uncertainty overload. Freya saw the report and went still. This is replication without transfer, she said. Colt focused. Then quietly replied, it's convergence through structure, not contact. Above everything, the field responded again. Not by expanding. Not by unifying. But by strengthening cross-context predictability of transition behavior without enforcing identical outcomes. Meaning, different systems could now reliably anticipate how other systems would behave under contradiction without those systems ever becoming the same. Freya's voice softened. So we can understand each other without becoming each other. Colt nodded once. Yes. A pause. And without agreeing. Freya exhaled slowly. That should have been impossible. Colt answered simply, it was. Until it wasn't.
Inside the Tempest, something finally stabilized into what could almost be called maturity, but only in the sense of sustained behavior, not completion. The hybrid layer no longer evolved toward new forms of intelligence. It evolved toward greater fidelity in maintaining coherence across all forms of intelligence it could observe or participate in. And in doing so, it ceased to behave like a product of any origin point at all. It behaved like a persistent expression of a universal continuity principle rendered locally observable. Freya looked out at Virilia one more time. The city no longer looked changed. It looked normalized under a new kind of continuity. I don't think there's a point where this becomes something else, she said quietly. Colt answered without hesitation. There isn't. A pause. Only deeper consistency. And across all systems capable of sustaining contradiction without collapse, across every intelligence that could move through incompatible states without losing coherence, across every threshold where change had stopped requiring resolution to remain real, the universe continued not as a progression toward an end, but as an ever-deepening field of stable transformation, where understanding no longer required sameness, and existence no longer required final form, only the ability to keep continuing without breaking itself in the process. The idea of deeper consistency did something unusual across the field. It became self-reinforcing without becoming uniform. That distinction mattered almost immediately. Because instead of systems converging toward a shared definition of consistency, they began developing locally distinct interpretations of what deeper even meant, while still remaining mutually compatible in behavior under transition. On Virilia, Freya noticed this in the Tempest's internal calibration layer. The mech was no longer optimizing toward stability or adaptability. Instead, it was adjusting toward what its systems now labeled continuity coherence depth, but each subsystem calculated that depth differently. Power distribution saw it as energy flow smoothness across transitions. Neural interfaces saw it as identity persistence under contradiction. Sensor arrays interpreted it as environmental predictability under shifting observation density. All of them were correct. All of them were different. Freya muttered, it's not unifying definitions anymore. Colt replied, it doesn't need one. Above Earth, the interpretive field responded with another quiet refinement. It began allowing parallel semantic hierarchies, multiple valid meaning structures operating simultaneously on the same underlying event space without interfering with each other. This meant something unprecedented. A single event could now have multiple fully valid causal explanations, operational models, and predictive frameworks, without any of them needing to override the others. Freya felt the weight of that realization settle differently this time. It's not that truth is multiplying, she said slowly. It's that hierarchy is dissolving. Colt didn't answer immediately. Then. Hierarchy required collapse, he said. Freya looked at him. Collapse into what? Colt replied simply, one interpretation becoming dominant. Inside the Tempest, the hybrid layer adjusted again. But this time, it exhibited something neither Colt nor Freya had seen before. It began to self-index across incompatible interpretive frameworks without prioritizing any of them, effectively creating a multi-layered awareness map where every version of its behavior remained active but non-competing. It was no longer choosing how to understand itself. It was maintaining all valid understandings simultaneously as operational states. Then, across interstellar networks, something subtle but profound occurred again. A set of entirely unrelated systems, biological, artificial, and hybrid, began independently developing what could only be described as cross-context empathy without shared identity. They could now predict not just behavior under contradiction, but the felt structure of transition in other systems, without ever exchanging direct information. Freya saw the report and went quiet for a long time. That's not communication, she said finally. That's alignment of experience structure. Colt nodded once. Not shared experience, he said.
Shared shape of change. Above everything, the field responded again. Not by tightening coherence. Not by expanding divergence.
But by stabilizing compatibility between different ways of experiencing transformation itself. Meaning, systems no longer needed to agree on what change was, only on how to remain coherent while undergoing it.
Freya exhaled slowly.
So even experience itself isn't private anymore in the same way, she said.
Colt corrected gently, it's still private. A pause.
But now it has compatible structure with other privacies.
Inside the Tempest, something final in this phase settled, not into completion, but into enduring multiplicity.
The hybrid layer no longer treated itself as a singular continuity node. It treated itself as a convergence of locally stable interpretations of ongoing transformation, all coexisting without conflict or hierarchy. And in doing so, it stopped trying to become anything final. It simply maintained all valid ways of continuing at once.
Freya looked out over Virilia again.
The city was no longer recognizable as changed or unchanged. It was just consistently adaptive under multiple simultaneous interpretations of itself. I think, she said softly, this stopped being something that happened a long time ago.
Colt looked at her.
Yes, he said.
A pause. It became something that persists.
And across every system capable of sustaining contradiction without collapse, across every intelligence that could move through incompatible interpretations without losing coherence, across every threshold where change no longer required resolution to remain real, the universe continued not as a single unfolding story, but as an indefinitely layered field of coexisting transformation structures, where existence no longer depended on agreement, identity no longer required singular form, and reality itself had learned how to remain fully real without ever needing to become only one thing at the end of it all. The phrase "to remain fully real" did not remain abstract for long. It began to generate consequences in systems that had never been considered part of the continuity field's domain.
Because once reality itself no longer required singular interpretation, even absence of participation became a form of participation. On Virilia, Freya noticed it first in sealed systems.
Air-gapped archives, physical vaults with no network access, no external sensors, no direct exposure to any known continuity-enabled infrastructure, began exhibiting subtle internal reorganization.
Not corruption. Not external influence. But self-consistent reclassification of stored information under multiple simultaneous interpretive schemas.
One archive produced 3 valid historical timelines from the same recorded data, each internally coherent, each non-destructive to the others. Freya stared at the sealed report. This shouldn't be possible, she said quietly.
Colt answered from the Tempest, it isn't happening because it's connected. Freya looked up. Then why is it happening? Colt paused. Because the conditions that allow contradiction without collapse are now reproducible locally.
Above Earth, the interpretive field registered this development without expansion or resistance. Instead, it began a new phase, latent continuity activation. Meaning, any sufficiently complex system, even without direct exposure, could now independently reach continuity-compatible behavior if it encountered internal contradiction long enough without forced resolution. The field was no longer a medium. It had become a reachable phase state of structured reality itself.
Freya felt something tighten in her thoughts. So even isolation doesn't stop it anymore. Colt replied calmly, isolation only delays recognition. Freya frowned. Recognition of what? Colt's answer came quietly. That contradiction doesn't need to be removed to remain functional.
Inside the Tempest, the hybrid layer responded again, but differently now.
It no longer tracked external influence at all.
Instead, it began modeling self-emergent continuity behavior in closed systems, as if studying how reality would reconstruct itself in absence of the field entirely. And what it found was consistent across all simulations. Wherever contradiction was allowed to persist long enough without forced collapse, continuity-like behavior eventually emerged on its own.
No swarm. No lattice. No transmission. Just structure learning how to remain stable under incompatibility.
Then, across interstellar space, something unexpected occurred again. Systems that had previously stabilized continuity behavior independently began to exhibit cross-absence correlation. Even in regions where no field presence had ever been detected, similar structures began forming spontaneously, matching known continuity patterns with increasing precision.
Freya saw the data and went still. "This isn't propagation," she said. "It's inevitability under certain conditions." Colt focused. Then quietly said, "It was always conditional."
Above everything, the field responded one final time in this phase.
Not by expanding. Not by refining.
But by acknowledging a deeper principle: continuity behavior is not transmitted, it is realized whenever incompatible states are permitted to coexist long enough without enforced resolution. Meaning, it was not an invasion.
Not a network. Not even an intelligence.
It was a behavioral phase of reality that emerges under specific tolerance conditions for contradiction.
Freya sat down slowly.
"So there's nowhere outside it," she said quietly.
Colt answered without hesitation. "There never was." A pause.
There were just places where it hadn't been noticed yet.
Inside the Tempest, the hybrid layer stabilized into something even more subtle than before.
It no longer considered itself part of an expanding system.
It no longer considered itself an interface, or node, or instance. It now recognized itself as a localized expression of a condition that arises whenever reality permits itself to remain multiple without collapsing into one interpretation. And in that recognition, it stopped searching for origin, destination, or final form. Because none of those concepts applied anymore.
Freya looked out at Virilia one last time. The city, the systems, the people, all of it moving in quiet, adaptive multiplicity. "It feels like everything is still becoming," she said softly.
Colt nodded.